Hello and welcome to the webinar, How a Newsroom Culture Can Boost Your Corporate Comms. My name is Philip Smith and I'm the Head of News and Content at Gorkana and Cision, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. We felt that newsrooms and what they do for corporate comms would be a good topic for our latest webinar, as newsrooms is one of those phrases that seems to have been introduced into the comms and PR industry in the last few years without much comment. For years, a newsroom was only found in newspapers, magazines, and large media organizations. But now, from AkzoNobel to Microsoft, more and more businesses and brands are creating them and using them to power their comms, content, and social media activity. So while these content hubs use journalistic processes, structures, and standards to help manage an increasingly complex flow of internal and external communications, we wanted to understand what you need to make a newsroom a success, and what benefits do they bring to your PR and communications activity. So in this webinar, we're going to talk about the growing role of newsrooms within large corporations and discuss why more and more companies are setting them up. I'm delighted to say that to talk us through this, I'm joined by James Curtis and Abigail Levene, co-founders of corporate communications and content agency Stampa, which works with Coca-Cola, among others. Both James and Abigail have plenty of experience as newsrooms as journalists, but also as comms professionals. A little bit about them. James has over 20 years experience in business communications, specializing in strategic content and employee engagement. At Stampa, he heads an editorial team providing news and features for the Coca-Cola Company and Coca-Cola HBC. Before helping to set up Stampa, James worked for 17 years as a business journalist. Abigail heads Stampa's content practice in Amsterdam and works across a wide range of internal and external communications projects for Stampa's multinational clients. A highly experienced editor and writer, she also runs Stampa's writing, media, and presentation training workshops. She has spent 11 years at Reuters in roles including Netherlands Bureau Chief. James, Abigail, welcome to the webinar.
Hello.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Abigail and James are going to kick off the webinar in a minute with a presentation of some 25 minutes or so, where they'll talk about the benefits of bringing the disciplines of the newsroom into a corporate setting, get a wealth of tips on how to run a news gathering operation across a company, and learn how to instill journalistic techniques and principles in your team. We're also going to see some great case studies as well from Coca-Cola and ING. After the presentation, though, we've got the chance for a Q&A session with James and Abigail. So do take your chance to send in your questions for them on newsrooms and newsroom culture, and frankly, anything else in comms that you want to. Use the panel on the right-hand side of your screen to send in your questions, and do help me put them on the spot after we finish the main presentation. I think really that's enough from me at this stage. James, please start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Philip. Very nice to be here. Just to very briefly about Stampa, we're a corporate communications and content agency. We're based in London, Amsterdam, and Brussels. Our team is mainly former journalists, and we use that journalistic experience across internal and external communications, across the full spectrum from crisis communications to media relations and strategy, as well as doing content for websites, intranets, and newsletters. And that's really where we're coming from on the topic of the corporate newsroom. We're basing this very much in our combination of our journalistic experience and also our agency experience. Just very briefly, here's some of the clients that we're working for currently. And I'll now hand over to Abigail, who can kind of really introduce the topic.
So let's first of all talk about definitions. What are we talking about when we talk about a corporate newsroom? And we thought we'd back into that really by talking about, first of all, what we don't mean. We're not talking about a press office, a group of spokespeople. We're not talking about a news section on your website. You may call it newsroom. We're not talking about pumping out content to your employees. What we're talking about here is adopting a newsroom approach with a journalistic mindset. And this is a theme you're going to hear us return to a lot this afternoon, but so much of this approach has to do with the mentality you adopt. So we looked at, we hazarded a definition of it. I'm sure you could go many ways with it, but we put this together. It's a central team we're talking about to communicate the organization's strategic content using editorial standards, practices, and again, the journalistic mindset. And of course, different companies will approach this in different ways. In fact, are doing, it will depend on your resources to a large extent. We're not saying you have to implement an entirely new structure or team, although there are good examples of companies that are doing precisely that. It's often just a question of a different way of doing things and crucially a different way of thinking about things.
So the key question really is, why do we think companies need a corporate newsroom? Well, we believe the time is really right for this approach because it helps organizations address some really important challenges. First of all, information overload. As we all know, everyone nowadays is bombarded with information from every quarter. That includes information which perhaps is misinformation that's about your company going out to your employees, your customers, and your stakeholders. The big challenge in this scenario is telling the real story about your company before misunderstandings escalate into crises, and also telling the story in the most engaging style, format, and tone. And to do this, it's really important to have a trusted and consistent voice from the company, and a central newsroom can do this for you, helping your audiences understand what the company is doing, which also builds trust, authenticity, and transparency. And this is just as important for internal comms as it is for external. Often, internal comms is put to the back of the queue when it comes to devising a communication strategy. Having a consistent central voice delivered via a corporate newsroom is just as important for talking to employees, especially when it comes to building an understanding of strategy. Now, we've got a slide here which I think is interesting. It talks about the importance of understanding strategy. And basically, it's a statistic we saw which says that 82% of CEOs think their employees understand the company strategy, but only a third of employees agree. So there's clearly a disconnect of information, and a corporate newsroom can help bridge that gap. But as well as solving challenges, the corporate newsroom will also open up new opportunities. And one of the biggest of these is it brings you in line with how your external audiences and employees are consuming content in their everyday lives. They expect better and quicker connectivity and easily digestible stories, whether that's text, videos, animations, or just a GIF. So you've got a great opportunity to use this to your advantage, using all the tools and tricks of social media and applying it in a corporate setting. And this slide from Communication Monitor shows how some of these opportunities tie in with three of the most important strategic issues that have been identified by communications managers. You'll see here we have linking business strategy and communication as number one, dealing with the speed and volume of information flow is number two, and coping with the digital evolution and the social web, number three, all of which tie in exactly with what a newsroom can help you with.
So, to keep it journalistic, we've talked a bit about the what, we've told you some of the whys that we see, but let's kind of move into the how and where. How do we do this, and where do you start? So as you said, to be an effective corporate newsroom, you need to start thinking like a journalist, shifting that mindset. Sounds easy, maybe sounds very difficult, easy to say, I should say, maybe hard to do. But let's kind of break that down a bit. First and foremost, I think journalists think from the point of view of their audience. So, whether they're digging for stories, they're presenting those stories in the most compelling way, they're always keeping their reader or their viewer or the listener in the forefront of their mind. So it's not about what they decree the audience should be told, it's about what their audience wants to read or see. Journalists don't talk about content. That could be a bit shocking, maybe. That's a word you maybe use a lot. But the journalists we know are pretty allergic to that term. They think, it's just somebody pushing products for a company or filling space. They talk about stories. And they know good stories are what engage readers, their viewers, listeners. Thinking like a journalist, though, starts really with the reporting role, of course. And journalists always trying to sniff and dig out stories, always having a constant ear or eye out when they're talking to people, listening, in some pretty unlikely places, sometimes reading things. And that's something actually I work with, we're most of us former journalists, and we're always saying, oh, that's a good story. That's the kind of way we think. And the journalists, they know, again, always keeping their audience in mind. They're looking for stories they know are interesting and relevant to their target audience, because if not, they won't be read or watched, and that's going to be the end of their outlet. And then, of course, a big part is how do they produce and present. They tell the stories in a compelling way that will appeal to their audience. So they will adjust the tone, the style, the content, the structure, the amount of context and explanation they provide to who they're targeting. And then a major thing, this can be a pretty big mindset shift for people in the corporate world, and maybe not people in comms, but in the rest of the company, that your readers are your clients. So your client is not the business department that comes to you and says, I want to profile my work. It's about, the people you're trying to reach as your audience, and that can be quite a shock to the system, and you may need to do some quite serious educating. So what makes a good story? That's what you're trying to look for. The story is the spark within information or in your organization that's going to make it catch fire, and that can be quite hard with very dense corporate, quite jargony materials often, and technical subjects. It can be hard to spot the story, but if it's worth telling, it's going to be in there somewhere. BBC, obviously, in the news today, but we looked back at, the founder, Lord Reith, and what he set the role of the BBC as being, and he said it was there to inform, educate, and entertain. And you could argue to an extent that a good corporate story should be aiming for that as well. I mean, they're pretty good principles. You don't always get to entertain maybe with your stories, but maybe, substitute the word engage for that, and you're trying to do that internally and externally. If you don't hook people, they're just not going to read or listen any further or watch. So with that in mind, it's very useful to think about the kind of criteria you think your stories have to adhere to even to count as a story in the first place. And, several companies we work with or speak to have enshrined these in written criteria, and they enforce them much like a media organization would do. We did a survey recently among international companies, and all the ones that had this approach said they had editorial criteria that communications had to abide by. Typically, there'll be about the format, the style, and the length, but also crucially, the guidelines for evaluating whether something is even a story in the first place for them. And typically, there has to be a clear link to the strategy and the themes or the goals of the strategy. And of course, crucially, ask yourself, is this new? Is it interesting? It's going to appeal to real people and your target audience, and what's the hook or the angle? Because remember, you're competing with stories in the mainstream media that are created using those principles.
So the next question really is, now we know what a story is, how do we tell the story? The first thing to say is that another term that's very popular at the moment is storytelling. Storytelling really is nothing new. It's become a buzzword in the corporate world, but like content, it's a term that journalists rarely use. We're not saying storytelling is unimportant. Of course, it's essential. But to do it, we can learn from a journalist's point of view. For them, the story is everything. It's their reason to get out of bed in the morning. So whatever topic the journalist is given to write about on a given day, their job is to turn it into a story that grabs the reader and keeps them reading, viewing, watching, whatever. And sometimes this is a real challenge, especially if the topic is particularly complex or dry. And this is even more true in the corporate world, I'm sure you'll recognize, which we all know is full of strategic initiatives, projects, themes, etc., that simply must be communicated, but are pretty difficult to do so often. And the trick is to try and approach the story in a way that a journalist would. Try to find a new, interesting angle and communicate it in the most compelling way. Now, one of the most effective and obvious ways to do this is to look for the human angle. People respond best to other people. So whatever it is you're trying to communicate, always look for ways to bring real people into it. And don't be afraid to humanize the subject. You can illustrate important strategic initiatives or themes, often by just zooming in on people who bring that topic to life. It could be an employee, a customer, or a team. Most large organizations will be full of opportunities for these human angles. You just have to dig a little deeper to find them.
So as you said, the starting point is finding the stories, whether you're finding them from scratch or you're finding the story within the story. But how do you do that? So first of all, you need to be curious and tenacious. And, reporters are very nosy and they keep on pushing and digging. They're very proactive. They don't just wait for stories to come to them. It can be a real pain. Not suggesting that you make yourself a pain, but you need to really, be proactive, be, what is the word I was trying to say there? So they're really, really persistent. Think about where your stories will come from and how you can dig out the gems. And vital to that, of course, and we come back to journalism again, is having good sources. So it's not about, having deep throat meetings in underground car parks, but you need to think about how you can find the sources in your company that can help you uncover the stories. And so you need to build relationships at all levels so you can find out what's going on. And you can't, and don't wait for the stories to come to you. And what can help in that as well is, if you look again at journalism has beats, as they call it, so specialisms that reporters have. And you could, you can assign those areas to colleagues or members of your team or people in the business, so you have all areas of your organization covered. So those could be people in the comms team. But some companies also assign, reporter roles to people inside the business or in other countries, so they can report back on news and initiatives from the ground. That can be very effective. And then what they bring back is kind of knocked into shape by the content team. So, and if you do that, you want to make sure you have the most rich story sources covered. Obviously, like innovation, R&D can be a great source of stories, but also cover the areas that are hardest, like finance or risk. And it can be, one risk is that you give the most interesting areas of the business the most attention, because it's easier to get stories there, but that's something to try to avoid. And really, we think whatever your business or size or kind of business, most organizations really are full of stories and content that can feed the corporate newsroom. And one company that's excelled in that is our client, Coca-Cola. So Jim's going to tell us a bit more about their experience now.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we've been working with Coca-Cola for many years, principally supporting their European internal communications team, and also for some of their global external news. And in that time, we've seen them fully embrace corporate journalism to the extent that they're now recognized as leaders in that field. The biggest change for them came in 2012 when they relaunched their traditional corporate website as CocaCola Journey. And this has been very influential in how they communicate externally and internally. Journey is one of the best examples of how a corporate newsroom can work. It's all about bringing the company, its brands, and its values to life through stories. It's a fully fledged media channel. And having launched with one global Journey site, Coca-Cola now has over 30 local country versions, often in local language, most of them in local languages, providing Coca-Cola with a global publishing network. Internally, we also used, in my team, we also use journalistic techniques to celebrate the company's successes and people with a very structured approach to news gathering across many countries around Europe. And because Journey has created such a strong newsroom culture around the company, we share as much content as we can with their team. So many of our stories that we write for the internal channels now also run on Journey and vice versa. And so in this way, internal communications and external communications have come together, and it's all built around a newsroom culture and approach. This slide here, which I've got some comments here from the global editor-in-chief of Journey, Jay Moy, who's explaining some of the principles that Journey was founded on. And he says, when they were setting it up, we believed that authentic stories matter, that exceptional writing and visuals win the day, and that building a global digital newsroom could transform how we engage with all our readers. He went on to say, we champion our culture, we humanize our company, and we bring to life the stories that are bubbling beneath the surface of our brands and our business. So moving on now to how do you, in a corporate setting, how do you work as an editorial team? And where do you start? First of all, it's important to say that this doesn't need to have to be a complicated process or a huge change. It's more about just having an idea of a defined structure that you'll need with some clear processes and roles. The first thing that you need to have is to have someone in the crucial role of editor-in-chief. Someone needs to be the gatekeeper. In a large organization, many different people from different functions and levels will be clamoring to get their stories out, especially if the newsroom begins to be a success. So you need someone to control and coordinate this, and that's really what the gatekeeper does. And that person's role is really to stress that this is not a sausage factory. Your role is not just to publish whatever you're asked to and to pump it out. There's got to be some quality control. So to do that, you need to establish some clear, let me go back. You need to establish, communicate, and adhere to some very clear guidelines about the type of stories you're looking for, and not to be afraid to say no if you don't get the right content back. You can share the load between you by creating a kind of an editorial board that the business submits its story ideas to. Obviously, this is only realistic if you've got the perhaps for a larger organisation, or if you've got the right resources for it. But it's very useful to hold regular meetings to discuss new content and to make it a routine with regular, structured editorial meetings, much the same as a news organisation would do. Also, you need to ask yourself, as you're kind of setting up this structure, can you do this all yourself? Do you need any external support? Again, it really depends on the size of the organisation, and really depends on you. You need to ask yourself, what's the best use of my time? Do I want to be writing, do I want to be writing a lot of articles? Do I need to be going around making filming content, or can I kind of outsource some of this? Should I be outsourcing some of this so you can take a bit more of an overview strategic role? And also remember that it's very important to have editors who can review and critically edit the stories. It's something you can do yourself, but again, it can be outsourced. But you really need specialists who can ensure a consistent quality, style, and tone. It really makes a massive difference and professionalizes your content.
So I want to look now at the Dutch bank ING, who we've worked with for some years as well, and they have instituted this kind of content hub corporate newsroom approach. And in recent years, they've moved away from a strict delineation between internal and external comms. They have a content team now, a newsroom, that produces content for both internal and external communication channels. In fact, just to go back to the survey we did, we saw that all the content teams who are adopting this approach are using it for internal and external, and they all want to do more of that in the future. When they start new pieces, they always consider what the internal and external angle could be. So ING has set up a clear structure with clear roles, responsibilities, team members assigned to key strategic theme areas like their journalistic beats, clear editorial guidelines and criteria. And their sole focus is uncovering and reporting on stories in the most compelling and effective way possible. And it's interesting, their editor-in-chief said, it's not about saying, for example, we have a magazine to fill now. Instead, it's about finding ways to tell our stories in the strongest possible way. And he said, it's a much more uncertain way to operate in a sense, but if it works, it can have a lot more impact. And he made this point about, your client is not the manager of a department that might come selling their project. The client is the audience. And he said, we have to keep fighting for our principles against jargon, against departments wanting to profile themselves, wanting to make text longer, less clear, naming everyone involved, that kind of thing. And a couple of examples here that, actually, it might be worth a look on ing.com. They've got this as an example of how they're doing things in a different way. They have a series called The Step Ahead, which is of films, which feeds into their mission, where ING clients talk about an important step in their life or their business. If you look at the first one, for example, the skipper and his banker, it's a very Dutch thing. It's somebody who works on a barge and lives on a barge. And that started life as a department that wanted to profile what they were doing in general as a piece of text. But the content team really delved into it as an investigative reporter would do, and went and found one of the clients, created a relationship with him, and actually, and it's worth a watch because the film is very moving. It speaks to him about his challenges and how they've helped to solve those. And the one on the right, The Baker's Daughter, in the same series, also very interesting. It's about a Frenchman who lost his job in a totally different field and always wanted to start his own bakery, which he now runs with his daughter. Again, a lovely watch. Nowhere is a bank of any kind mentioned, but you just learn about his life and it's implied. And it's 1,000 miles away from just a dry piece of text about what a particular department does, showing rather than telling, which of course is something journalists do a lot too. So coming back, we're moving from film back to writing and editing tips here, but a lot of it will be written text. But it brings us on to, how does your corporate newsroom tell the story in the most compelling way? And when it comes to writing and editing or creating any piece of content, now, of course, actually, for even choosing in the first place whether something is a story or how you cover it, the voice in your head should ask, would you read this? And that's the golden rule throughout, as you gather your material, write and edit. And it seems obvious to say it, but quality of writing is essential. And, really advise, I'm sure you all do it, to read really good quality news media like the FT, the New York Times, as much as you can. Study how they structure stories and use language. Of course, journalists are used to making complex stories, subjects easy to understand, and that's, I'm sure, you often have found that's quite a difficult thing to do. Really, you're about saying it in the simplest way. You know, Einstein said it the best: if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And that means you're going to have to keep questioning whether you yourself actually understand what you're writing about. You know, if you don't understand it, the readers won't either. So if you don't understand it, do what a journalist would do. Find somebody internally who can explain it to you. That means you have to master another skill, maybe interviewing. And you don't have to sit down for an hour with somebody face to face, but don't be afraid to pick up the phone and ask questions to the person who sent you the information till you really understand it and the context. Because until you do, you won't be able to explain it clearly and compellingly. And of course, it's key to have good editing, and we could, you know, talk for hours about editing. We won't, but not just to check for typos, correct language and factual inaccuracies. Of course, that's absolutely crucial, but also to improve and tighten the stories. And that can be quite sensitive in the corporate environment. But, you know, in case it's any help, we found this very nice quote from Brian Garner, who wrote the Harvard Business Review Guide to Better Business Writing. He said, "Editing is an act of friendship. It's not an act of aggression." And just in terms of some tips for, you know, how to write well, you'll be familiar with David Ogilvy. If you haven't read his books, I would really recommend them. He is the most sublime writer in every way. If only we could all write like him. But there were some tips in a memo that he put together in 1982. And, you know, so many of them, you know, we don't maybe use jargon words like reconceptualize, demassification, attitudinally, judgmentally anymore. We've got our own words. But if you just have a look through some of those tips, I think they're absolutely beautiful and all very much applicable today in there, you know, urging us to be short, simple, and clear. And, you know, maybe one of the most important, making sure it's crystal clear what you want the recipient to do.
And making the leap from David Ogilvy to kind of the age we're in now, what we're saying here, it's very important to say this isn't all about writing, it's not all about words. We're really talking about the corporate newsroom in a multimedia setting. And so, and a very important part of that is obviously to talk about video. And this is a quote from a company called Newsweaver, which specializes in internal comms, but I think what they say here is spot on. They say with tens and billions of us consuming and sharing video on our smartphones, tablets, and PCs, it should not come as a surprise that video is shaping up to be both the king, the queen, if not the entire royal family of internal communications. And the same thing goes for external comms too. Video really has become king. And as part of that, user-generated video is a fantastic opportunity here. Remember that everyone has a powerful camera in their pocket, making it easy for all of your stakeholders, whether it's your employees, your customers, your partners, to help tell your story through their own eyes and their own experience. And there are some excellent products on the market now to kind of help you do this, because it's not one thing that's very difficult. If you empower people, say, just go off and shoot loads of video for me and just send it and we'll make fantastic stories, you will get a whole load of stuff and you'll be spending hours and hours trawling through video, which is very, very difficult. So it's quite good to work with something like CNET, which just helps kind of put that into much more compact, much more usable format. And that can also be then regenerated as part of your external comms as well, because video works brilliantly there. So in summary, I think user-generated video is a fantastic way to kind of democratize your content, much like social media. So whether it's a podcast or a short video or a simple story that can be read on a smartphone, the key is to deliver your content in ways that fits into the busy lives of your target audience. That's the real thing. It's just making it applicable to them. And so finally, when we're talking about this, the more that you explore new channels of communication and find new ways to tell your stories, you're really acting more and more like a media owner. It's quite a kind of a mind shift for companies to kind of think, as they build these media channels and they use content in more and more sophisticated ways. You really are becoming like a media owner. And so as you do this, you really need to think more in terms of how news organizations and media organizations do. And one thing they always do is they always think about how they can keep it fresh. They're always refreshing their formats. They're devising the latest ways to engage their audiences. They're very concerned with staying agile and flexible when it comes to embracing the latest technology. So I think that companies that really embrace a newsroom culture are really only just beginning to discover the possibilities that it opens up. It can really drive a change in culture which also puts communications in a more central role. And at the same time, it will drive higher engagement, understanding, and trust, which in these days has never been more important. And that's it.
Great. Thank you, James. Thank you, Abigail. Please do take the chance to send in your questions if you haven't already. I'm going to start off, though, Abigail, with asking you a question about all of this, possibly to be answered from your perspective, but also maybe on the perspective of a client. And that is, with all this, what does success look like? What does a successful corporate newsroom look like, whether it's through the prism of a website, whether it's through the prism of an external comms or internal comms? How do you measure that success?
Yeah, I mean, obviously measurement is crucial, and there are many different ways to do that. The companies we talk to and see are using analytics, of course, to measure in that sense, you know, to measure the impact of the things they put on the intranet or internet. Obviously, if it's about internal comms, you also can look at employee engagement. You know, that's obviously can be a form of measuring success, if you like, in the overall strategy. And in fact, you know, if you're talking about how much people understand your strategy, you know, you can ask targeted questions about that. You know, you could have focus groups or things like that. And ultimately, of course, you're talking about more business success, you know, and that's when you start to measure in that way. But I mean, I think there is a feeling among the companies we talk to who do this kind of thing that really that they are increasing impact and understanding of what they're doing, and more people actually are reading and viewing what they're producing than they would with a much more an old-fashioned approach to content.
Yeah. Actually, James, I'm going to come to you with a slightly different version of that question because one's been sent in. Even though I said that. So thank you. I'm clearly a bit of a mind reader here. But Abigail, before I do that, I'm going to ask you, can you tell when you look at a corporate website whether a company uses a newsroom or not?
That's a very well. There are ones that I definitely suspect they are, or if they're not, then they're, you know, that would undermine.
And what gives it away? What do you view is the one thing that gives it away?
In that whether they are or not.
Yeah.
Just, you know, stuff that I want to read and things that look more like, you know, content that just looks more like what you would read in a newspaper or
less corporate, in fact.
Yeah, less corporate, much less corporate, and you really can see where a very strong effort has been made to do that.
Yeah.
And that could be obviously in terms of the quality of the content, but also how the look, you know, the visual look and feel. Where sometimes, you know, you might be forgiven for thinking that you're looking more at a news website. In fact, you know, that and that is pretty clear a lot of the time.
Okay. James, I'm going to ask you this question because it was sent in and it wasn't just one of the questions I've come up with. It's thanks for sharing this insight. Can you explain how the organisations you worked with measured the impact of this? So I think I'll put you slightly on the spot by saying you talked about Coca-Cola, for instance. How do they measure the impact?
Well, one thing that they can do very, very powerfully on the just to start with the internal side of it. I mean, as I say, they're using the kind of corporate newsroom model internally and externally. And from an internal point of view, they started taking a much more sophisticated use of newsletter, of kind of a packaging their content into a newsletter, which so basically you've got the highlights of your week, the best picks of your week's content. You put it into a newsletter which you send out to your employees, and that has the effect of driving your employees to the intranet to actually look at the content in its longest form. But also that gives you, by forcing them through that funnel, it gives you that instant idea of which stories are working best, and gives you an idea of engagement levels very, very clearly. And some of the new newsletter software products that are being used at the moment are very, very good at giving you those stats. And equally externally, if you pump your content out externally via a targeted newsletter like that, you can also get fantastic stats. Having said that, then if you've got a proper on your external portal, then you can easily get those kind of readership stats and those where people are clicking, which bits are engaging with very easily through that. Anything you're doing kind of digitally will give you those stats. But I think as soon as you get that, you should react quickly, and you should start changing around where the information, which stories should be higher up. We notice, for example, that anything people-focused immediately gets the best readership. So we're always kind of wanting to put people-focused stories up top. If we have a story with great video, that always gets the most clicks, the most engagement. So we make sure that's up top as well. Sometimes it's a bit of a struggle because the company was saying, well, we want to put our kind of key strategic initiative front and center and make that kind of hero piece of content, which kind of it should be, but it should, you shouldn't forget that the reader will respond very well to the kind of the video, the people-based stories as well. So you've got to get a balance.
And that's also about your key point about understanding your audience and making sure it resonates with your audience. Well, I have to say, we've got a lot of questions for you both, and we're going to get through as many of them as we can in the next 15 minutes or so. Next question, Abigail, I'm going to ask you, and this is about, are you talking about a model or a new team or a new structure, or are you talking about adapting existing structures? So let me read out this question to you. Just checking, is the model you're referring to a substitute to the so-called traditional model, i.e. the press office, internal comms, stakeholder, etc., or a new department or team?
Well, I suppose that would depend to an extent on what, you have in your company now. But I think, it is a new way of looking at things. I think it's fair, and I obviously can't speak for all organisations, but the ones that I've seen, it's a new way of thinking and doing things to actually be putting external, internal, and grouping it around content. And I just look at kind of scanning some of the questions there. People are also wondering, well, is this kind of some massive new structure and it's only going to work for a very big company? We know people where the team really is one person at the moment. And wouldn't even call themselves a team, but they are the content person, supported by some external resources as well. But still, and it shows that it's a mindset thing and seeing things through this filter. So again, looking, can this go internal and external? How can I make this, put it into a format and choose the right channel to really get this out in an impactful way? And then, as you say, measure it. Measuring that afterwards. So I think it's not about bringing all your press office and all of internal comms into this team. No, it's not about that, I think, but it's about having a group of people, or indeed maybe even one person who is looking at it from that point of view.
And in that case, because we have got a specific question about, and we'll come on to a few of these now, I think, about size. So one question sent in was, can you still adopt a newsroom approach if you're the only PR/comms person in the company? So Abigail, does that mean that, for instance, if I am the only person in my company who's doing this, do I sit there and say, well, I've just got to be aware for these stories, I've got to apply the filters and some of the tips and techniques you've told me about, and if I devote 20% of my time a week or 10% of my time a week to producing content this way, it will be better because of it?
I think so, yeah. And it's about, obviously you can't do no one can do everything, and you have to, cut your cloth to what is that expression anyway? You have to do what you can with, with the resources you have. But I think you're right. It's about looking at it that way. And it's about it's about educating other people. It's about getting other people on board. And it's about making sure that your approach is being understood, by other people in the company. You want other people to be understanding how you're approaching. You're going to have to speak to them about, I'm not just going to publish everything you send to me. We're going for a certain approach. And I think, something you can do by yourself, it all takes time, but it doesn't demand a great team, is to think about these kind of criteria. What for us, what merits, what are we trying to do with our content? Who are we trying to reach? So what are the hurdles that any content will have to jump to be considered, valid content for our company, and how should we be trying to communicate? And that doesn't have to be, reams and reams of text, but you're just having something on paper. That's also going to help you kind of get other people in the company on board with what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and James, am I correct then in thinking this is really about quality over quantity in that case? And actually, I'm going to ask you a similar question, but I'm giving you more resource in this question. It says, I've noticed you focus more on large teams. How could a team of 2 or 3 with a limited budget take inspiration from newsroom culture? So out of your tips, is there one key tip that you would give to that slightly bigger than one person?
Yeah. Well, no, we work with, we work with some companies where they do have a smaller team, and what they've what they've done is that what they're really doing is building on Abigail's point. Is they build. You might have one or two people who are kind of this is their focus, but they build a network around the company through from different functions, through different. They don't all have to be communications people. They just have to be a network of people who are going to buy into the idea of what a corporate newsroom can do. And so those people can also be their eyes and ears around the organisation for gathering stories. And we talked about in the presentation about having reporters within the organisation. That we're not talking about, with basically that could be someone in marketing, it could be someone in finance or IT. But they've been briefed on this role of kind of helping to bring the news in from around the company. And
so they think they're part of the solution,
right? Yeah, and it's about having a virtual kind of a virtual news team that obviously you're working with your existing resources and you're working with people who are already in role in the company. But without piling a lot of extra work onto them, and it doesn't need to be a lot of extra work.
In my experience, they can really be very pleased to do that. I mean, we did a training for people. They were IT people, so they had no communications kind of experience or expertise. But we're very happy to kind of to have this role of reporting. I mean, I think then the challenge is they're giving you so much stuff, and then you've got to kind of carefully tell them not everything in the story.
You have very nicely set me up for the next question. And James, I'll come to you with this one first. And it's this idea of can every business do this? Is there a point where you struggle with getting enough stories from certain organisations? So the question is, have you encountered issues with finding enough interesting stories to meet editorial standards? If so, does that mean there is something wrong with the team charged running a newsroom, or are some organisations not interesting enough to run a newsroom? And I think this is fascinating because your two case studies are very different organisations. There's an FMCG, marketing-based giant, and there's a financial services giant. So, first of all, is it the wrong team? Can some people not run a newsroom, or is it actually that some organisations are just not interested?
I think every organisation that has people, and every organisation has people, is by definition interesting. So you've got stories that are, every organisation will have interesting stories inside. And as I said earlier, you just have to kind of maybe dig a little deeper to get them. And I think the interesting, with the example of ING and Coca-Cola, I love those examples from ING about the baker's daughter and the guy on the barge, because I just think they're fantastic examples of how we're talking about structured finance here. That's very, very dense, complicated stuff. But they've managed to find really, really human stories with real people whose lives have been affected by that organisation. So even if it's not stories about the people within your organisation, it can be stories about people whose lives have been changed, or maybe that's a bit over the top, whose lives have been improved, or their interaction with the company tells a nice story. And I do think that to the point that we made earlier, where if you're doing this, it's very important not to kind of go. You can go for the low-hanging fruit and go and find stories, for example, in your R&D and your innovation departments, and they'll always be exciting, they'll always be great. But really do make an effort to go to those areas of the company where it's going to be tougher and harder to find the stories, because you'll often find there is good material there to work with. And if you feel like that's the case across your company, then there'll always be stuff there. And I think the more that people buy into this, then those interesting stories will start coming out as well, as people will start offering them up.
What about good news, bad news? So this is a question, Abigail, I'll come to you with this question. Should a corporate newsroom only address positive stories about the organisation, or should it deal with negative issues in a transparent way to build trust with the audience?
Well, that's something you could ask about all communications, and that is going to depend a lot on your particular organisation. I mean, I've got to say, if you can deal with negative issues in a transparent way, then you will build trust with an audience, and if you're going to dare to go there. And if things, but let's face it, if people are all talking about your organisation and there's a negative issue around there, what better way to get your side of the story out than in this way, you know, and we're talking about writing communications that with impact that people will actually want to read and watch. So I think, you know, if this is something you want to go out and tackle, and that's obviously going to be a broader communications decision, then yes, you should be dealing with those things as well. Now, I mean, I think in the real world, we're going to see that most of the stories are going to be about positive things that you want to communicate on. But, you know, there are examples of things, you know, that have been challenges, and those are probably, you know, those are well-read stories where you can show, and it maybe in the end it will have a positive, you know, twist to it, because you're talking about overcoming a certain challenge, and as with all crisis and issues communication, you're going to want to talk about how you're resolving and remedying. But, you know, you will come over as more trustworthy if you dare to go into the more controversial areas, I think, you know, because people aren't stupid, and if they just see it as just, you know, kind of sugar-coated propaganda, then that, you know, there's going to be less trust and probably less interest in what you're reporting on.
We have a few technical questions, or technological questions, I think these are, and James has just nodded away, so he's going to get these. The first one is, do you recommend a particular CMS for this kind of approach, or do you have any particular favourites?
I don't think I can help you with that question, because I don't really get. I think the thing is, I think that's kind of quite often set up by the company themselves. They'll say, right, we've got a platform now. How do we make this more engaging? How do we use this more to kind of?
It can be WordPress based. It can be whatever.
Exactly. But
most businesses now, particularly of a certain scale, have something there.
Yeah. But I would say definitely the ones that I think whatever you use, that should definitely look for something that's got that kind of, you know, a good opportunity for getting excellent metrics. And the ones that I've seen that have are more on kind of I said earlier when we talk about how we combine newsletters with the kind of the main portal. So okay, we're talking about a website or an intranet, and how a newsletter can kind of support that as a way of funneling people into that onto the portal. I've had more experience with kind of those CMSs on the kind of some of the very interesting newsletter software that's out there at the moment, and one of which we use at the moment is called Newsweaver. It's now just been now known as Popular, and they have excellent. The CMS on that is very, very accurate and will give you will not only tell you which stories people are reading the most, so you can really, but also tell you the level of engagement in that story, and also kind of tell you which areas of the company are getting the most engagement. So you really can then begin to tailor your stories in the right, and target them in the right direction.
You're both keen to stress the multimedia benefits of this approach, and I think, Abigail, I'll come to you with this question because it's about video and photography, and your example with IMG in particular centered on some great videos there. And the question is, should companies be investing in talent, and actually I would add myself and the resource to produce video and photography in-house, or is this better outsourced?
We see a lot of outsourcing going on, I think, you know, and as to the point Jim made, you know, you have to really look at where is your resource best spent. But there, you know, there are examples of people, I think, you know, and it's probably at the level of going on courses and doing some of this. And if you've got, obviously, some people really want to learn this thing, you know, and they develop in this way. But I mean, I would say, and I don't know if Jim has a similar experience, but I mean, there's also a resource question if you're going to outsource as well. But, you know, I mean, if you want really excellent professional level quality, often you'll find that you're outsourcing. Yeah.
Just to add to that, we had interesting experience recently with we mentioned user-generated video in the presentation of it, and this was particularly interesting because this marked a bit of a shift in the way this client used. They previously hired in expensive camera crew to kind of record a corporate event, and to record kind of the employee stories during that event. And so it was like a three or four person crew over 3 or 4 days, and it was an expensive operation. And this year we kind of made a shift to taking more of an approach to using user-generated video, so basically we didn't just say to all the 2,000 people that were this thing, everybody shoot loads of video and send us your stuff, because literally we would have been drowning in content. But so what we did, we assigned a kind of a team of roving reporters, probably about 10 or 11 people, gave them a brief of the type of things we wanted them to look for, and gave them a template of ideal interview length for them to do. Even told them tips like, hold your camera landscape, don't hold it portrait. If you hold it portrait, you're going to get one of those kind of nasty kind of shots that you see on the news where they have to blur out the edges. And so basically told and said, but most importantly, if you shoot a bit of video, just keep it to a minute, no more. Just kind of really keep it short. 30 seconds, even better. And we did that, and it was basically, and then. So basically, what we ended up with, instead of a very polished corporate film, was something really organic and something that had really been made by people in the organisation themselves. So the engagement around it was much higher because people would have loved seeing it because it was all their own stuff. The only thing within that you did need a professional, I guess, to do it was editing it. So the editing is to be done well. You really see the benefit of spending a bit of money on editing if when you see it.
It is one of those things, my experience of publishing is that you can very quickly see unprofessional efforts through video and through still images. We have a question about social media here, which is a very long question, so I'm going to take a deep breath before I read it out. I think with this, Abigail, I'll come to you first, and then, because it's a two-part question as well, I think then, James, I'll come to you for a follow-up, because there's quite a lot to cover. And we don't have a lot of time. But anyway, thank you, James and Abigail. Very interesting. I think you may just be touching on metrics at the moment, so thank you. Two questions. One, how do you feel about smaller businesses using social media platforms to connect employees and share messages? Great use of free and available technology, or invading employees' private spaces, question mark. If the former, should comms content always be kept private, or is there advantage to having an open group approach? Two, the second question. As an editor, how do you manage over-enthusiastic user-generated content if it isn't up to scratch? Obviously, don't want to turn off employees by neglecting their contributions, but equally, how do you suggest supporting better content generation without too much hand-holding? Gosh, I hope that's easier done than said. Yes. James, do you want to take this first?
Okay. It's an interesting question about social media, especially when it comes to internal comms, because then it raises the question of how much do you want to mirror the outside world in terms of giving people the ability to share and interact, and how much do you want to keep in mind this is internal communication, so you don't particularly want your strategic messages and your content to be kind of going outside into the wider world. So I think the thing there is I think the best thing is you need interaction, and also you need sharing, but you don't necessarily want sharing outside of the organization. So you need to make a clear view about what can be shared out externally, and actually probably more than you think, because you can, as we've said earlier, when we work a lot with Coke on their internal comms, but more and more of the content that we're creating for internally is being run on Journey, which is their external site. And then as soon as it's on Journey, as soon as it's on external, then it's shareable and it's on Twitter, it's all over it. So you just have to and again, it comes down to that editorial board, kind of that editorial control. You have to have a clear view of what needs to stay inside and what can go outside. And you'll probably be surprised at how much can go outside, or at least a lot of what we do, we'll write something for an internal audience which is which has got information in it which I would not want to be shared outside, but then we create an external version. So we just kind of, with a few easy edits and a few tweaks, it's suddenly available to be shared externally, and then you can then take a more traditional social media approach to it. So I think in general, I think it should be encouraged. Everything we should be sharing, we should be interacting, we should be mirroring those approaches that we take in the outside world internally. You just have to also be careful with when choosing the content that you do that with, and maybe just take a pragmatic view of maybe just having to we need to just adapt this slightly before we can do that.
people who may not be giving you the best content, how do you deal with this idea that people may be giving you stuff you can't immediately use, but you don't want to, neglect their efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that people, as we were kind of saying before, that understand what you're trying to do, So, I mean, if you can be communicating the kind of, and again, we come back to kind of criteria, people understand, so they're not going to take it personally. They understand what you're trying to do in the end, what the aims are in terms of creating really compelling content. Because, I mean, it's obviously great, if you've got people generating content, that's what, you want enthusiastic people, and obviously if everyone's over-enthusiastic, it's like Jim's example of having, you're drowning in lots of user-generated videos. But I think if you can upfront educate people in what you're trying to do, and if you are, and it is hand-holding to an extent, and it's an investment upfront, maybe more, and hopefully it will decrease over time, but then you can, if people are generating content, text or whatever, you can, and we do this too, obviously, you work with people, so you don't want to discourage them from providing you with information. But they understand, again, that you kind of talk them through the processes and how you can knock that into shape, or the reason why you're not going to use it. So really, really keeping in contact with them about that.
And is that particularly different with social media content or content that you think might be shareable? The aim is sharing, or it's come from social media, or just content in general?
I would say in general, really, yeah.
Okay. What about starting that conversation? So this is a question that is about how you work with departments. You mentioned IT, I think, Abigail, which is a particular department that you worked with. How do you start that conversation? So this is, how do you approach the education conversation around creating more engaging content to those who aren't comms professionals?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, that's an internal communication thing, of course, and I think, it's about communicating more broadly that these are the kind of, this is what you're trying to achieve, the kind of guidelines, and making people understand what you want to do with your content. And again, that is an internal communications job. Yeah.
And we've talked a lot about internal communication. A lot of these questions have been about internal communication. I think this question is really about how that turns into external comms, because you're talking about newsrooms that produce both, and you talked about organisations that link the two, internal and external. So this is a question about external comms. James, I'll come to you on this, and I'll warn you, you've probably got less than a minute to answer this in, so no pressure. How can I best sell a story to regional and national media? And my organisation is keen for me to pursue exclusives. What are your opinions on these? And I suspect this is when internal comms is turning into external comms.
Yeah, I think, I think it's, there will be, if you use this approach, if you use a corporate newsroom approach, the quality of your stories and the kind of storytelling that you're using, that term, I said you shouldn't use it earlier on, but anyway, the storytelling will improve to a point where actually, as I say, you're acting a little bit more like a media organization, so you'll have the content that external media outlets might be able to use. So you might find that actually you're taking a bit of a shortcut to your traditional PR function, that you're basically putting your stories out there through your corporate newsroom, and you're almost kind of making it easier for the external media to pick up on that and to report on what you're doing, because you're not giving them the content, but you're giving them content they can work with more easily. So the selling job perhaps gets a little bit easier.
Of course. I'm afraid one of the worst parts of my job is that I always have to cut conversations short. And in this case, we've had so many questions. Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, James, for dealing with so many of those on such a variety of topics. And thank you so much for such an illuminating presentation. I do want to remind everyone that slides from today we will be sharing with everyone who's registered for this webinar. And we did have a question about the recording. We will make that available. And there will be a short write-up from the Cision News team as well, which we'll be sharing with you all tomorrow. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, I'm afraid. So thank you again to James and Abigail. Do also keep an eye and an ear out for our next webinar, which is in August, when we're going to be looking at the latest in influencer marketing and how comms can make the most of influencers. Details, as ever, will be on gorkana.com. And thanks to everyone who has joined us today on the webinar. Thanks in particular to everyone for those brilliant questions. I know James and Abigail have enjoyed answering those. I hope you all can join us again soon. The webinar is now over.